Hello and welcome back to the Living in the Teal podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and today we're going to be talking about your premenstrual besties. So I have noticed that there are two distinct characters, let's call them. I wouldn't call them archetypes as such, but two distinct characters that show up in the premenstrual phase for a lot of people. And that is the inner critic, which we're all totally aware of, right? I think most people are aware of the inner critic and how it might show up, especially if you struggle with PMS. And then the second one I want to introduce you to is the inner bitch. And we'll talk a little bit about reclaiming that word bitch, because that has been like a really big process for me and really powerful process. So, inner critic and inner bitch, and these are your premenstrual besties. And these are kind of the ways that your premenstrual phase can kind of show up. These are parts that kind of live in your premenstrual phase. I mean, they don't live in your premenstrual phase. They can show up at any time, but they can become particularly active in your premenstrual phase. And they're kind of, I guess, two parts that are pretty misunderstood, or they certainly were for me before I started doing all of this work. If you're anything like me, I definitely felt very I really disliked my inner critic. I mean, I wouldn't say do I like it now? I don't know, maybe like is, I really, I embrace it, but I really struggled against it and really, just was like, please, can I just get rid of my critic? Because this is just like a nightmare. And same with my inner bitch. I was really ashamed of her. And I think a lot of that is from social conditioning, which we will get into. But I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we can kind of work with these parts and create a new relationship with them, because I hate to break it to you, you cannot get rid of them. You can't just get rid of parts of ourselves, but we can work with them to build a new relationship and perhaps help them do their role in a slightly more updated way that is appropriate to where we are in our lives currently. So I'm going to talk a little bit about working with them in the moment and some kind of strategies for that. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about, once we've kind of addressed those two, there is this archetype, this kind of self-archetype that we can kind of make way for to shine through and really connect with, that really will connect us with the gifts of inner autumn. So I'm going to briefly mention that. And then I think I'm going to do another episode, perhaps the next episode, on this archetype. And the archetype's called the Muse Beloved. So the inner critic, what is its role? What is its role other than to make us feel shit? No, it has a very important role. It has couple of incredibly important roles. And as I describe these, notice in your body or any thoughts or feelings, like if anything sparks, because again, everybody is unique, and I think there's this common misconception that you just have one inner critic, and I really, really feel very strongly that is not true. Like, inner critic is a type of part. A critic is a type of part, right? And a lot of us will have multiple critics that get triggered about different things, and will have different ways that it shows up. So, it could show up as like imposter syndrome or shame or, these kind of things. So just feel into like what resonates for you. And if it doesn't resonate, totally fine. Leave it. No worries. Take what resonates and leave the rest. So the first one that I want to talk about with the inner critic is, it's really highlighting where we are abandoning ourselves or out of alignment with ourselves. And this can often show up when we kind of berate ourselves for doing something that didn't feel good, or like was like, oh, why did I do that? Or, it kind of felt like it wasn't really in alignment with the person that you are and who you want to be. And our critic is kind of trying to point that out. It's kind of giving you that truth serum about, where are you out of alignment with yourself? Like, actually, are you masking? Are you pretending to be somebody that you're not? And that, if we're not used to listening to that intuition and that alignment, that is when the critic will come out and be like, hey, excuse me, you've not listened for this too long. This is bullshit. I'm shutting this down. And it kind of has fairly, what's the word? Like outdated kind of ways of getting us to listen to that. So it'll have to come out with this kind of like, well, you shouldn't have done that, and da-da-da, and all of this kind of quite aggressive, self-demeaning stuff. But what it's actually trying to do is there's like a 1% truth in it. It's trying to like point you to like, hey, like maybe that wasn't really who we are and who we want to be. And so maybe let's not do that again. You know, it's trying to point that out. The other way that the critic might be operating is to try and protect you from feeling something. Perhaps feeling something that at some point in your life you didn't have the resources and tools to feel. So an example I'm going to use is shame. So we fuck up and we hurt someone, right? Then the critic comes in and goes, oh my God, you're a horrible person. I can't believe you would do that. You are just like, you are the worst person to ever live and walk the planet. And I'm like, yeah, okay, sure, thanks. And what it's trying to do there is, if you notice that it jumps straight to the criticism, but actually in between that, if you slow down enough and you can observe it enough, there is likely a moment where you fuck up and you've done the thing that you're not proud of or whatever. And then there's guilt and shame, guilt or shame. Now, guilt is I have done something bad. Shame is I am bad. So I have found that the critic can often be a lot more volatile to shame rather than guilt. So it's when it's that I am bad, and then that's what it latches onto, and it goes, yeah, you are. Yeah, you are. But it kind of has, it goes, yeah, you are, but in this like angry way. So what you're feeling is like this anger towards yourself, or this, it's trying to like, it's masking the shame underneath. And you might find that you can feel both at the same time. I often still have that is when my critic gets flared up, I actually am in tune with that shame, and I am in tune with the feeling beneath it. But what I've come to know is often true is that critic is really trying to stop you from feeling the raw emotion. So whether it's shame or sadness or anything else underneath it, or loss or whatever it is, it's kind of trying to protect you from that, because at some point, it might be true that at some point in your life, you didn't have the capacity to hold the raw emotion. So your critic has come in to go, all right, no, cool, we can deal with it. It might even be that it goes, okay, no, we can deal with feeling shame. We can deal with like it being towards us. We can deal with internalizing all of that. We know how to handle that, but we don't know how to handle, the fear of a caregiver, not accepting us, or the fear of our partner not being angry with us, So you can see how it's trying to protect you from these bigger emotions that perhaps at some point you didn't have the capacity to feel. And this is where we can really call on that South archetype, which I have talked about in previous episodes, where we can really feel, we can go, no, it's okay. I'm safe to feel this. I am safe to feel what is coming up. It's okay. We don't need to do damage control. We don't need to switch into shame or anger. We can just be with this. We can be with this, and that's okay. And that might mean being with the anger as well, right? So those are kind of two key ways, and this is not an exhaustive list at all. But those are two key ways those are two key roles that your inner critic can play. One, to kind of protect you from feeling emotions that are perhaps kind of a bit too much, and so it's easier to feel angry or guilty or shame or kind of berate yourself. And it's also pointing out where you acted out of alignment with who you really are and who you really want to be. And it's trying to kind of point you towards that. So it can be this really amazing creative ally when you learn to kind of rebuild that relationship with it and have a conscious relationship with it, a conscious boundaried relationship with it. The next part I'm going to talk about is the inner bitch. So this is kind of what I characterize as when our premenstrual goes outwards at other people, which has been such a huge part of my journey, is how it has impacted my relationships. And I see this with so many people, and it's often one of the biggest sources of shame, because it's kind of like we can deal with it if we're just like cross with ourselves or we're just pissed off with ourselves. But it's really hard to deal with when we hurt other people. And I think there's another layer to this where it's often this kind of shame of, oh, I'm being such a bitch, isn't actually when you have hurt other people. I mean, it might be when you've let other people down, but sometimes that happens because you're setting boundaries or because you're actually prioritizing your needs over other people's for once. So in terms of reclaiming the inner bitch, so the label bitch it's really used as a way to put down women who are prioritizing their needs and their boundaries and their power. And this is something that was really my experience, or my first experience with this word, was I was often called a bitch as a teenager when actually I was having very reasonable responses to people who were not treating me well at all. And it was actually my first therapist who said to me, she was like, what does that mean when they called you a bitch? Like, what were you doing? And I was like, well, I was just kind of standing up for myself. I was really very, very often as a teenager labeled as a bitch for saying, no, I don't want that. Or no, I don't think this is acceptable. So my first therapist said to me, okay, well, if that's what being a quote unquote being a bitch is, I want you to try and be more of a bitch. Because that is exactly what like your perception of what being a bitch is and you being a bitch is really not like, that is really like good. There's having boundaries. Like, that is your definition of being a bitch at the moment because of this conditioning is a woman who has boundaries, a woman who says no to things that are not in alignment with her, a woman who prioritizes her needs. So that's just a really interesting shift, and it was so powerful for me to think of it that way, that actually my perception of what it means for me being a bitch is probably like not me even being that bad. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, really reclaiming that aspect of yourself that maybe has been labeled as a bitch, but actually is just the part of yourself that's like, nah, I've got boundaries, I've got needs, I want this, I don't want that, no, go away, yes, I like that, this kind of stuff. So I think really relabeling that as a powerful part of yourself. And so what's the role of our inner bitch? And she's the one that kind of is more in that relational space, because as I've talked about already, it's a lot about boundaries and prioritizing our needs and that kind of thing. And so there's a couple of things, and again, not an exhaustive list. Take what resonates, leave the rest. I'm just speaking from my experience. So first off, she can be trying to point out those boundaries or needs that are being unmet. So being unmet, but also that you are ignoring. So we're not just putting this on the other person. We're not just saying like to the other person, oh, you don't meet my boundaries and that's why I'm being like, letting my premenstrual rage out at you. No. There's an element where the only reason it's got to this point is because you've probably ignored it. You've gone, no, I don't need that. No, that's fine. No. Because it's a lot easier to do that in our spring and summer, right? It's a lot easier to do that when the estrogen's flowing and it's our like giving hormone and we're just like, yeah, I can just be everything to everyone and it doesn't matter and all of that. But in our premenstrual phase, it's like a bit of a wake-up call, right? And she comes along and she goes, actually, do you know what? I'm really pissed off about this and you should be too. And this is not acceptable. And so she has this like huge, massive reaction. I don't want to say overreaction, because for that part of you that is in charge of your boundaries and stuff, she ain't overreacting. Like, she's having a perfectly reasonable response to like how she perceives the situation. So that's one thing she can be kind of addressing. And then the second thing is that she might be projecting something within you. And this is where it gets a little bit more nuanced, and you kind of have to start doing this inner work and really having a strong self-awareness and strong relationship with your parts as well, to be able to go, okay, I actually don't think this is about the other person. And it could be that something from your past is being projected onto your partner. I'm going to use the situation of your romantic partner, because I think it's easiest to demonstrate this. You could be projecting something. So, the classic is like mummy and daddy issues, and you project that onto your partner. Or she might be kind of like highlighting something within you. An example, let me try and explain this in an example. So an example would be, you're really pissed off with your partner because you feel like they're super closed off and they're super distant from you. And you're like, what the fuck is going on, man? Like, I want this connection. I feel really distant. I feel like we're not connected. And you're blame. You're at them. It's their fault. And it might be that they're closed off. Very true. But are you also closed off? Are you looking at, hang on, what are the ways that I have closed my heart off as well? In what ways have I created distance in this relationship? And regardless of who started it, in what ways, if he's initiated that distance, in what ways am I reflecting that and buying into that? And also, maybe I started it, and maybe this is actually a really good way to just like shove the blame on that person and then not have to look at my own stuff. I mean, the other way, a more personal example was, I would date really avoidant people. Really avoidant. I was drawn to like hyper avoidant people. And so I was like, oh, I'm always like attachment style avoidant. I'm really, really anxious. I was not anxious. I was dating people who were more avoidant than me so that I didn't have to address my avoidant tendencies. I am massively avoidant. So that's just another example of that projection. But anyway, back to the inner bitch in the premenstrual phase. Because, the inner autumn and this west kind of facet of our cycle is so tied to the shadow, and shadow is often showing up in projections, that's often what she can be highlighting. So it might look like it's about the other person, but actually there's something within us that she's kind of pointing out, and she's kind of indirectly doing that. And obviously there's nuance to this, and sometimes people are just being arseholes and we're not projecting. Like sometimes people are just, it's just not cool, and how they're treating us is not okay. And then other times it's a projection, and the only way to discover that and discern that is A, practice, and B, like treating it as if it is a shadow. Treat it as if it is. Treat it as if it is a projection, or it's a part of you, whether it's a projection from the past or projecting what you're doing, and you're, kind of, again, bringing that inner critic where you're out of alignment with who you are and that sort of thing. Really treating it as if it is that, because that is the only way that you'll find out if it is or not, because you'll go into it, you'll journal about it, you'll meditate with it, you'll move with it, whatever your process is, and you'll go, no, do you know what, I actually don't think this is about me, this is like a boundary, this is something different. But it's I think the other marker that I really use for this is like if the feeling is very non-specific. So if there's non-specific anger and you're like, I'm just pissed off with you and I don't know why, often that's a projection. So that's another really good marker that you can use for that. So those are the two ways that I have just feel are particularly prevalent in how the inner bitch can show up and what she's trying to do. So she's, just to recap, she is either trying to point out a boundary or a need, or she is projecting something outward that needs tending to within you. So to start working with these parts, I want to recommend that you download my free resource, the Premenstrual Survival Pack, if you haven't already, because there is an inner critic exercise that you can go through with that, and it kind of guides you through journaling prompts, or you can use them as meditation prompts, but I've kind of done it as a journaling exercise, through the steps to kind of really get to know what they're talking about and what that 1% truth is, whether that is truth about the situation or truth as a projection and what's going on within you. Helps you get to that 1% truth, but also helps you like create a new relationship and see these parts that perhaps you might have shunned or not seen as valuable, or actually just seen as like really destructive and inconvenient and just kind of makes your life a living hell. You can start to rebuild that relationship as like with these two parts as creative allies. So definitely would recommend, I'll put that in the show notes. But aside from that, really, I would recommend like giving them a voice, journaling, meditating, however you want to do this. Stop pushing them away. If that is what you are doing, don't push them away. Don't shun them. Start to listen to what they've got to say and try to create a little bit of distance. Keep yourself regulated. Again, in that premenstrual survival pack, there are some kind of nervous system soothing tool. And then if you are really finding this super powerful and these parts are just like so totally overwhelming, I want to invite you to book a premenstrual processing session. So you can get 30% off as well when you sign up for the premenstrual survival pack, the freebie. And we can kind of bring both of our energies to sit with this part and just see what's going on, to see what they've got to say and what they need and that kind of stuff. And please remember that this is a practice, that you are not expected to become, a master in talking to your inner critic and your inner bitch and not letting those lash out at other people and that kind of lash out at yourself. You are not expected to become a master in that ever, honestly, because I still have times where I have to check myself and be like, okay, that's what's going on, And I think this is the other important thing, is that actually the goal isn't to try and get rid of these parts, because if you notice what I've been saying is that they have quite an important role. Like, these are things we want to know. We want to know about our boundaries. We want to know when we're out of alignment with ourselves. We want to know where we might be projecting and what things within us need tending. We want to know all of these things. So actually, if we got rid of them, we wouldn't have that potential for growth. And if you're listening to this podcast, I am assuming that you are on a kind of self-development, growth, healing journey. And so these can become really, really important allies in that. It's just you have to reframe that relationship a little bit and start to kind of recalibrate it a bit. So you're not trying to get rid of them, and you are not expected to be skilled at this. This is not a one and done thing. Like, this takes practice, and that is okay. That is okay. There is medicine in that journey to, shifting from kind of suppressing these parts or really feeling dominated by these parts almost, to having them as creative allies in life. And I said that I was going to mention this archetype of the Muse Beloved, and the reason I'm doing this is because once we've kind of built that relationship with the inner bitch and the inner critic, we start to see because those are kind of the shadowy aspects of Inner Autumn, the shadowy, westy kind of part. And the other archetype, the self archetype, and self as in with a capital S, the Jungian self, the facet of the self that lives in our Inner Autumn in the West, is the Muse Beloved. And they can really help you tap into the gifts of Inner Autumn in a slightly different way. And this is often the journey that people go on with healing PMS. Is they go from this kind of quite a painful experience in their Inner Autumn to really tapping into the Muse Beloved, so that we can get that similar information that the shadow is giving us, where are we in alignment? How can we tap more deeply into love? Where are we censoring ourselves and not expressing ourselves? We can tap into the Muse Beloved for that. We can tap into that self archetype rather than these wounded archetypes, these wounded parts of us that we are relying on to give us that information. We can start to tap into the Muse Beloved to start giving us that information. And that just transforms the whole experience of your premenstrual phase. And of course, this archetype is available to us at all points in the cycle. We can tap into all archetypes at all points in the cycle. But there is a natural connection, a natural energetic connection and tendency with the Muse Beloved in Inner Autumn. And I am going to save that for next episode, so be sure to tune in to the next episode if that is something that you are interested in and that has piqued your curiosity. All right, my love, I will see you in the next episode, and thank you so much for your time and attention in listening to this episode.